All right, welcome back to segment 2 on our lecture relating to the work of Michelangelo. We left off talking about Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. We're going to start looking, we had started looking at and talking about some of these sort of secondary figures, the Sibyls and the prophets and the Anuti. And remember, he used these figures to sort of work out dynamic compositions. Now we're going to focus a little bit on the main spine of the ceiling that depicts the stories of, or the book of Genesis. So we're looking at a detail right now of separation of light from darkness. So one of the things we talked about with high Renaissance painting was that it was very balanced and very symmetrical in the sense it was balanced both vertically and horizontally. However, Michelangelo broke away from that a little bit. Here he's not incorporating its balance, but he definitely has a very significant diagonal line with the figure of God in the center. So typically a high Renaissance would try to incorporate the X composition, but he doesn't do that. He really tries to emphasize this diagonal line. And this gives the viewer a sense of tension and it makes the image more dynamic. Also, what's interesting about this piece is that we're looking at God. This is the figure of God from below. And it is a very daring view. It's not the most flattering. You can almost look up his nostrils. So here's another image to look at. And so it's just a very unusual sort of depiction of God. You know, it's not the most regal or formal picture or depiction that we've seen before. This is another detail. This is the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. And notice the foreshortening that Michelangelo uses to depict the arm of God, and that's you know, a way for artists to depict depth and three-dimensionality in their work. That's one of your vocabulary terms, so if you don't know what that is, please look it up. And also, here's another scene. This is also God, and it depicts him rushing off. So, you know, he's created, you know, these celestial stars and you know, planets, and now he's sort of rushing off after he's done his work, and it's kind of funny because he's rushing off so fast that you actually get a glimpse of his little bum. So again, Michelangelo not, you know, obviously taking a sort of humorous and sort of informal approach to depicting God. And it's very charming, I think, and meant to be charming. Also, note the use of that term I had mentioned earlier, terabilita, which was this sort of use of this very stern, tense expression. He first used it in the statue of David, where the face was very tense, but the body was in this relaxed contrapposto position, and sort of, you know, the two differences contrasted with each other. He also incorporated it in this statue of Moses that I showed you briefly. And then you can definitely see that he's also used it in his painting as well, and sort of transferred that convention over. And again, the term is terabilita. I'm saying it wrong. It's spelled Terribbilita with an enunciation at the A. So again, that's one of your vocab terms, so make sure you know it. Now we're going to take a few moments to look at the creation of Adam. It's probably one of the more well-known and sort of famous of the frescoes depicting the book of Genesis. So let's look at a detail closer. So remember, with Michelangelo, the figure was the most important vehicle, and we really do see his knowledge of anatomy. Again, he's using that diagonal to sort of divide the two figures of, you know, between Adam and God. Let me kind of go back and show you. So he's really sort of playing around with that dynamic use of the diagonal line. And note the space between the hands, so they're not touching. And this is called synopsis, or synopsis, S-Y-N-O-P-S and he's intentionally depicting a moment. God is about to ignite Adam with life. So he hasn't done that yet. So it's just this moment before. So it's intentional to have that negative space there. And when you do look at the figure of Adam, he does kind of look lifeless and lazy. And so some historians think that he has not been ignited yet by God. He kind of looks like he's just woken up. Let's see. Let's look at some other details. Also note the use of the very sensitive facial expression of Adam. You know, he really does look very sweet and innocent and serene and youthful. And, you know, again, that was something, you know, that we saw with Michelangelo's depiction of the Virgin Mary, the sculpture, the Pieta, and that youth for him really did equal this idea of innocence. And obviously, you know, before the fall, Adam and Eve were thought to be innocent. And again, and here's a detail of the face of God. And then here's a detail where you can actually really see that sort of gap. We'll also see this arm again. Remember I talked about how people sort of quote Michelangelo, future artists will quote Michelangelo. So we'll actually see a sort of reference to this arm of Michelangelo when we look at some of some painting during the Baroque era in Italy. This is another scene depicting the temptation and expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden. So here we see that the serpent is in the form of a woman. You can sort of interpret that how you want. Eve is very passive and turns to accept the fruit. Here she is depicted here. And Adam takes the fruit more aggressively. So again, maybe making some sort of gender associations or how people thought of men and women during that time. And then here, so this is the scene, the temptation. And then here on the right side, we have the expulsion. And note how their facial features are definitely more distorted. And also, this scene features cast shadows, and this was again supposed to be a sign of mortality, that they are no longer mortal, and so that they do, you know, they're mortals like us, and would, you know, cast shadows in the sense of natural light. Here, there are no shadows depicted, and again, you can see the really bulked up, very masculine figures, even with the female figures he's depicted. They look very very masculine and very their muscles are very articulated. So here's a view of the chapel again. We're going to go here and talk about this altar fresco, the Last Judgment, which is another popular fresco. And we have looked at some Last Judgment scenes before. Do you remember? What period and what medium? So this is a Last Judgment scene that we looked at during our study on the Romanesque period. This is where we had this explosion of church architecture, and churches were being built, and people were taking pilgrimages to these churches. And then above the entryway and or the portal to these churches, usually there was some sort of apocalyptic scene being depicted. And so this is the Last Judgment scene, which was sort of a popular scene to have. And this is where the weighing of the souls occurs, and who gets into heaven and who gets into hell. So this is actually a relief sculpture. And remember, with the Romanesque period, the Romanesque period is called Romanesque because it means in the Roman manner. And they really, in terms of architecture, sort of picked up on the arch and sort of really incorporated that into their architecture. Their figures, however, were very medieval, and not anatomically correct and very stylized and abstract. So this is a good one for you to know, and then, obviously, perhaps you might be confronted with maybe comparing and contrasting Michelangelo's fresco of the same scene. So we'll get back to that. So here's Michelangelo's version, and again, it's a different medium. It's a fresco and not a relief sculpture, but it really does follow sort of the traditional iconography typical of Last Judgment scenes, where you have the figure of Christ in the middle, and then you have, the damned sort of on the right side, and then the rescued on my left side. So the arrangement is very traditional in that sense. So again, this scene was depicted and executed on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. It is a depiction of the second coming of Christ and the final eternal judgment of God for all humanity. The souls of humans rise and descend to their fates as judged by Christ, surrounded by prominent saints. So this is the figure of Christ, and then here are various saints and other religious figures, including St. Catherine of Alexandria, Peter, Lawrence, Bartholomew, Paul, Sebastian, John the Baptist, and others. This is a groundbreaking concept of the event, and it shows figures equalized in their nudity and stripped bare of rank. So that was something else in a way, that depicting these figures in the nude sort of stripped them of their, associations related to class and aristocracy and rank. The artist portrayed the separation of the blessed and the damned by showing the saved ascending on the left, again, so you can sort of see them ascending and floating up, and descending on the right side. The work itself took 4 years to complete and was done between 1536 and 1541. Preparation of the altar wall began in 1535. Michelangelo began working on it 25 years after he finished the Sistine Chapel, so the actual sort of barrel vault of the Sistine Chapel. So this was a project that he really could not seem to get away from. So let's look at some details. Here we see Christ is depicted in the center. He's on a vertical axis where he is surrounded by the blessed on the right and the damned on the left. Mary represents an intercessory figure to whom one can pray. So this is her over here. I'm sorry, she's depicted on the left. Yeah, I said that. No. And she's actually sort of framed. Look at how he's framed her under the arm of Christ. And it appears like he's almost protecting her. Christ is really posed in an unusual way where he is sort of blessing and condemning at the same time. So it's like he's sort of blessing the figures on the right, and then the figures on the... I'm confused. Let me look at this again. So yeah, this is the damned, and these are the blessed. Okay. And I think I mixed it up when I first introduced the work. So he's sort of, it's an unusual and very economic gesture to sort of have this, to incorporate this pose. And also, again, we've really focused on the idea of, that Michelangelo really liked the male figure, and even so much that he sort of made women look very masculine. And here, the figure of Christ looks like a superhero as well. He almost looks like a comic book character. And comic book artists have referenced and been inspired by the work of Michelangelo. So again, and this is an unusual depiction of Christ. We see that he's beardless, so going back to that sort of beardless representation that we saw with early Christian art, and, younger, but again, he looks like a wrestling star. He's just so huge and so, heroic looking, and again, very depiction of Christ. So it's really important that I show you details because there's just so much going on. You could look at this for hours and just find, these little details. And so here's a detail of the souls that are ascending and hopefully are going to be saved. As usual, the other side, the hell side, is usually probably the most fun for artists to work on in terms of composition, because it's just much more energetic. There's a lot more energy going on, and I think it's probably one of the more dynamic scenes to depict. So this is an image here that I want, or a part of the detail I want you to really note. This is Saint Bartholomew, who was martyred by being flayed and skinned alive. And so we actually see him holding a sort of suit of skin. And some schools think, some schools of thought and art historians think that this is actually a self-portrait of Michelangelo. So if you look really close, let me see if I can zoom in. Let me see if I have a detail, which I don't. Let me zoom in really quickly. So they actually think that this is supposed to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo. So again, you can really start to interpret some pretty heavy ideas about how he might have viewed himself and his identity. And, again, this is sort of a very haunting, if it is in fact a self-portrait, it's a very sort of creepy and haunting one. This is another detail. And here you see all sorts of sort of mayhem happening. This is the souls that are sort of, descending and are going to ultimately be damned. So there's lots of chaos, lots of fighting, and, people trying to look out for number one and, look out for themselves. Here, I think here you have this sort of demonic figure who is, taking the souls, down the river, and they're sort of all crammed into this boat, and it looks like a really horrible experience. Here's another detail. So this is where the souls are dragged down to the boat where they will cross the river into hell, who's manned by this figure here. And again, note look at this figure. They're really heavily muscled figures. And this provokes the idea that even the strong cannot fight against the devil. Look at this. This guy has a serpent around him. But it's just, look at that. I mean, they really do. I mean, you never think about it because it's, it's the Vatican. It's, the Sistine Chapel. But, I mean, it's just, to me, kind of odd. I mean, these figures are just so crazy looking and bulked up. So this is another depiction, detail, and this one is actually noted in the AP. Your AP list has this as a specific one that they really want you to understand. So in addition, Michelangelo chose to paint the flood, the sacrifice of Noah, and the drunkenness of Noah in this... oh, I'm confused. I've messed this up. So this is actually part of the original Sistine Chapel. I'm so sorry. So I should have put this before the altar. So this is not actually part of the Last Judgment scene. Okay, this is part of the actual ceiling and not the altar wall. So I apologize for that misplacement. So before, backtracking and going back to the actual Sistine Chapel, the ceiling, Michelangelo also chose, in addition to depicting the Genesis and the Annuity and Sybil and prophet figures, he also chose to paint the flood, the sacrifice of Noah, and the drunkenness of Noah. And these were some unusual choices to incorporate into this composition. So we're going to focus on the flood. So the first part of the story is relatively well known. Sometime after Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, humanity is largely turned away from God. Fed up with all of it, God decides to wipe everyone out with a massive flood, but chooses to save the one man he finds to be righteous, Noah. He tells Noah to build an ark and fill it with his immediate family and pairs of animals. When the rain comes, the ark becomes a floating shelter. So here, we see it right here, this sort of floating shelter. Michelangelo, it's interesting because Michelangelo is painting the moment where the flood is rising and people are trying to save themselves. So we see people trying to climb trees and they're sort of grasping at each other. And it's a very sombering scene. We actually see a husband here carrying his wife on his back up the hill. A mother tries to save her 2 babies. And a father hoists his adult son onto a rock. And, I think this is an interesting scene because these are supposed to be people who are evil through and through. But that's really not the impression that Michelangelo has given us. Instead, we see people who seem to love each other. We see mothers, the depiction of fathers, innocent children, and so we kind of question, is this really bad? Are they really that bad? And so I think why the College Board wants us to focus on this particular scene is that it's maybe perhaps that Michelangelo is forcing us to consider a very difficult part of this story, that in fact God killed lots of people. And it's easy to picture the people as despicable, horrible, and no good as a whole society of criminals, say, and try to overlook just how alarming this divine act really was of the flood. But then, again, the way he has portrayed these figures, I mean, there is an emotional element to it. You do start, as the viewer, to wonder, well, were they really that bad? There's a quote from the Bible that says, every inclination of their hearts was only evil all the time. And so this is a very absolute statement from the Bible, and I think with Michelangelo's depiction of this scene, he might be suggesting that the real picture of this story is definitely more complicated than that, and it's not as cut and dry or black and white, as that quote would have you think. So, and again, I just want to reiterate that this is not part of the Last Judgment altar fresco. It is actually part of the Sistine Chapel ceiling frescoes, so I apologize. All right, so returning to the Last Judgment fresco. Sorry about that. Michelangelo finished this work a few years before the Counter-Reformation. The Last Judgment was an object of heavy dispute between critics within the Catholic Counter-Reformation and those who appreciated the genius of the artist and the mannerist style of the painting. And you'll understand that because the next segment we're going to talk about is sort of an offshoot of High Renaissance art called Mannerism. But Michelangelo was accused of being insensitive to proper decorum in respect of the nudity of the work itself, and of flaunting his personal style instead of trying to come up with appropriate depictions of the various content he was expressing. He was considered to have gone too far, especially in his depiction of the beardless and very muscle-bound figure of Christ, which we looked at earlier, which was, clearly adapted from classical sculptures of Apollo. The nude figures started to be seen as shameful again. So remember, we had kind of gone into this period, with the medieval period, the figures were sort of viewed as shameful, a sort of a vehicle of sin, and with early Renaissance painting, and even the early Renaissance painting and sculpture, we started to see this sort of emergence of classical ideas and this return to the human figure as being sort of a beautiful form of expression. But now we're starting with the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, that nudity is a problem again. The painting was censored, and actually what happened was the genitals of some of the figures were painted over and even sometimes chiseled out. They sometimes painted over the genitals, like with a fig leaf. And Michelangelo was so upset by this, and I think he was just like, he had just had it. And so I think this was sort of a bitter way, for him to have sort of finished this project, especially since he, the whole project of the Sistine Chapel, especially since he didn't really want to do it in the first place. So that concludes our segment on Michelangelo. On Monday, we will have a guest speaker come and speak about Michelangelo, so hopefully you'll enjoy that. Again, I want to remind you to please look at the videos in your resource folder related to Michelangelo from Khan Academy. And also, if you want, you can always kind of look up some of these works in your textbook. See you next time.